Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Native Americans of New England, History, Colonial Legacies, and Survival. We're going to explore the history of Native Americans in New England, while we will not turn a blind eye to the impact that colonization, dispossession, and racism had on the story of Indigenous peoples in our region. We will also explore Native American resistance, adaptation, and survival under often harsh and unfavorable circumstances. Moreover, we will examine some of the colonial legacies that still shape the views and misperceptions about Indigenous peoples to this day. So this talk is led by Christoph Strobel, who's a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. He is the author of many books, including War and Colonization in the Early American Northeast, Native Americans of New England, The Global Atlantic, 1400 to 1900, The Testing Grounds of Modern Empire, and he was the co-author of Daily Life of Native Americans from Post-Columbian through 19th-Century America. Christoph has also published 3 books on immigration, and his scholarly essays appear in many academic journals and in various edited collections. So all nearly 200 of us who are watching live and the hundreds more that will watch the recording, let's give Christoph a big virtual round of applause for being with us tonight. And Christoph, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. It's thanks all of you for showing up. Thanks to Robert for inviting me. It's great to see people from all over the state and really the United States. It's quite humbling. My name's Christoph. I'm actually an immigrant to this country, so I am not an Indigenous person. And I look at Indigenous history often as from a perspective of an outsider, and this is why colonial legacies and colonization play an important part in a lot of the work that I do. So really looking at the impact that colonization had. So the purpose of this talk is 2 things. To teach you guys a little bit about history. We're going to cover the whole 16, 17, 20,000 years of New England Indigenous history in 45 minutes. But we're also going to talk a little bit about the colonial legacies that shaped us, how they show up. But we're also going to talk about, and that's another important part of the subject, is the continuous survival. So I want to start out there we go. We're talking about an issue that has been in the media as of late, and that is the state seal of Massachusetts, because it is one of the most obvious visible legacies of many. And we likely will have a new state seal at some point, which might be much overdue, but that's a different question. I want to talk a little bit sort of about the history of these visible legacies to kind of underscore how these visible legacies are really with us, and we often tend to forget about it. So as you look on the screen, on the right-hand side, you have the 17th century seal of Massachusetts, and that shows a very scantily dressed Native person. On a day like this, where we have record heat, that dress makes sense, but for much of the year, it doesn't. And he has a speech bubble coming out of his mouth saying, "Come over and help us." The Commonwealth of Massachusetts has really gone through a multitude of seals since this original seal, but in the 1890s, they settled bringing back the Native American theme. And so it's kind of, in many ways, a better seal than the 17th century one. The offensive speech bubble is gone, the Native person is dressed, but there's also, when you look into it a little bit, there's also a couple of very upsetting disturbing features about the seal. So when you look at the body of the Native American on the left-hand side, that was based on an archaeological find in Winthrop, Massachusetts, so just north of Boston. But the head of the person is actually a person from out of state, out west, and they took a Native American model and put his facial feature and hair on top of the body. Now, the sword above the head, which is actually comes in from probably an earlier seal that was just then put over, but it also kind of looks a little bit like a 17th century sword, is also pretty interesting because it's part of a lot of the indigenous colonial warfare in the 17th century was accompanied by decapitation. So in the first military encounter between the Plymouth colonists, or pilgrims as they're often called, and the Massachusetts Indians, there was a decapitation, and one of the leaders' heads was piked outside of Plymouth colony. You look at the belt, Garrett, the seal designer in the 1890s, used King Philip's belt or Metacom's belt for that. Metacom too was decapitated in the during King Philip's War, and his head was piked outside of Plymouth Plantation for 2 decades. Various other indigenous leaders suffered the same fate. The indigenous Wampanoag leader, Weetamoo, she was killed outside of, decapitated, and then her head, if I remember it correctly, I think it was piked outside of Taunton. So this is why this sword and the Frankensteinian Native American reeks of a lot of symbols. The arrow, the bow that you see on the picture, like the belt, is also at Harvard Peabody Museum, and that was retrieved from a Native American that was killed outside of Sudbury. So there's a lot of this kind of symbolism in the seal. And again, the motto on the seal, which is comes from the Revolutionary period and is from a prior seal. But again, in the combination between the seal, the sword, et cetera, is also, and knowing the history of indigenous colonial relations and post-colonial relations, by the sword we seek peace. It's quite quite a summary, and we'll get back to this. You find the kind of visible legacies in terms of sports mascot, and I'm not going to pick on Tewksbury, but in all these kinds of symbolism, statues, wall paintings that often take very, very controversial perspectives in there. And we can maybe pursue this later on in the discussion and chat. There's other legacies, intellectual legacies that we suffer from in terms of our educational system. We've been fed a lot of the New English myths of wilderness, virgin land that was inhabited by nomads that in no way or shape really are representative of the deep historical realities. You take a walk in many of the New England forests and you come across these stone networks. I live up in the Merrimack River Valley. As many of the people in the chat are, the stoneworks and ancient history that is going back there, and still controversial to this day. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening, a lot of cool things going on. There's also a lot of ecological stability here. If we're to believe the 17th century colonists, in terms of wildlife, fish, incredible resources. This was a world of social complexity, many, many villages, towns, cities, communities, people that interacted. Indigenous people in much of New England practiced agriculture. Because there were no domestic animals like cattle, horses, chicken, Native Americans had to what we call hunt. But really the hunting culture or the fishing culture was much more complex. Like, right, if you go down this way, you get to Pawtucket Fall in downtown Lowell, and there used to be scaffolding built around waterfalls like Pawtucket. And really all over that in spawning season, people would stand on the scaffolding and pull out fish in large quantities, fishing weirs that were constructed, and you can still find evidence for them all over New England. There was a sophisticated landscape management of burning forest landscape to take care of the underbrush, to broaden out the forest, to make hunting more easy, but also to spur growth of new plants that then increased animal populations and so forth. So a lot of interesting things are happening. New England, not as like urban as other parts of the Americas, like the Midwest, the South, or the Central America and South America, but still, there's plenty of evidence that shows how New England is tied into long-distance exchange networks through burial mounds, but also through wampum that's being traded all over the eastern United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a vast ancient history, indigenous history in New England that I wanted to just briefly mention here to give us a little flavor to really establish that indigenous people lived here for tens of thousands of years, or for at least 10,000 years, 12,000 years, 13,000 years before Europeans showed up. So what happens with colonization? I'm going to just not give the micro history of the Pilgrims or John Winthrop and his interactions with Native Americans, but I want to look at a couple of themes that hit indigenous people in the 16th and 17th century. A lot of them we are familiar with: the dispossession of land, the dismantling of community, racism. But the other thing that is more talked about today, but is an important thing to underscore, is also the issue of disease. I just mentioned that there were no domestic animals. And that had the impact on many indigenous people that they just did not have immunity to a lot of diseases that existed in Africa, Europe, and Asia. And so with colonization, these diseases came and they had a dramatic impact. In the Lowell area, some of the colonial records suggest that as many as 90% of the indigenous people perished as a result of disease. Of course, there's also warfare that's tied in, colonization, losing land, starvation. So disease is part of this broader ecosystem, and scholars kind of argue about is 70%, 80%, 90%. What we know, in fact, in places like New England is that colonization and diseases that has an impact there, and probably a very dramatic impact, leads to the eradication of about 90% of the population in the 16th and then especially in the 17th century. The other thing that is quite dramatic in the history and the indigenous history of New England, and we're starting to talk about this a little bit more, but still not enough, is the issue of slavery. And thanks to the New York Times, we tend to think of 1619 Virginia. We got them beat. So the history of slavery is also tied in here. The way that a lot of the early contact interacted is that Europeans came to raid for slaves in the coastal areas in the 16th century, and that went into the 17th century. Ever wonder how Squanto learned such good English? He was a person that was matter-of-factly captured. The person who captured him and the crew tried to sell him off on the slave markets in Spain. Some Franciscan friars apparently got themselves involved. He was freed, ended up in the household of an English investor who spent a lot of money investing in New England, sent Squanto back with a couple of officers. That military, this mission was matter-of-factly killed of Martha's Vineyard by another runaway enslaved person. Make a long story short, there is long interaction of enslavement and the coastal people of New England, and is the reason why a lot of the coastal people are quite reluctant about the outsiders coming in. The history of slavery, of course, continues. There's this incident, or this war, really, a very violent and genocidal war called the Pequot War in the 1630s. And it's an incredibly bloody conflict. Massacre of Mystic is in a lot of US textbooks, where a large party of mostly women and children are burned alive, and those that aren't destroyed or scalped. It's the first time in New England where we have scalp bounties being used by colonial governments. More on that later. Anyway, and then after this big massacre, there's a lot of tiny wars and wars of attrition that are going on that the English colonists put on the Pequot, their allies. And I say English colonists, the English colonists, of course, also use indigenous allies in their warfare against indigenous. Make a long story short, at the end of this conflict, New English colonists take several hundred Pequots captive. And the colonists, like the guy I mentioned earlier, John Winthrop, who's sort of in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and several of his circle of friends and leaders, they start talking, well, you know, the Romans called their war captives slaves. The other thing that is happening is that some of the enslaved Pequots, or the Pequot war captives, which they are legally recognized at that point, are exchanged for people of African descent that come into the colony. And increasingly, the New English elites are talking about that these really are enslaved people. And so it's Massachusetts Bay Colony, which really is the first English colony, so way before Virginia, several decades, that puts slavery, or a system that we today recognize as slavery, on the books. And that includes indigenous people, and that includes people of African descent. And in New England, just as even in the Carolinas, et cetera, the number of indigenous slaves was higher throughout the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, it was quickly overtaken. This is also the case in the Carolinas, for example. So this is a history we don't often talk about, but this is very much part of these legacies of colonization. Of course, there's also an important part of the story of survival. Yes, maybe as many as 90% of indigenous people in the 17th century die of disease and the impact that colonization, warfare, dispossession has on them. But there's also a lot of adaptation. There's a lot of resilience, and there's a long struggle by indigenous people to maintain their sovereignty in many corners of New England. By the sword, we seek peace. I'm going to bring the state motto back to really just kind of dive in the importance that warfare really played, and warfare against indigenous people, in creating the place we today call New England. So I mentioned earlier King Philip, and King Philip was sort of, actually his name was Metacom. He gets often kind of like the bad guy in the war. And when we talk about King Philip's war, it is more not only about Metacom, it's about many indigenous communities that had long exposure to colonization and grew increasingly frustrated and saw a lot of their rights being taken away. They lost a lot of territory, and it's this sort of increasing displeasure that kind of built a lot of anger in these communities. Then there was outright pushing by colonial governments, extreme bad policies, and pushing sort of Native Americans into a direction that really led to this explosion of this conflict we today call King Philip's War in the mid-1670s. So it's a complicated conflict, but you just put it in a nutshell. the indigenous population had already shrunk, probably roughly from 140 to 120,000 in the early 17th century to about 30,000. Whereas the English population had grown to 50,000. So you can look at that number game and you can sort of realize that Native Americans were quite concerned. However, it's also important to say that there were also many indigenous people that ended up siding with the colonists in this conflict. And in fact, the Pequot, the Mohegans played an essential role in Connecticut's efforts during King Philip's War. And in fact, were probably the reason why Connecticut was far less brutally impacted during King Philip's War than, say, places like Rhode Island or Mass Bay Colony or Plymouth, who Massachusetts Bay Colony uses indigenous allies until October. Then they decide to put them on an island, several of the what are called praying town Indians. So these are Christian converts, communities all over New England who have converted to Christianity. And it's in these communities that several people decide to fight alongside the colonists. And they play a very essential part in the early campaigns of Plymouth and especially Massachusetts Bay Colony. But in October, the situation, the anti-indigenous sentiment in the colonies in Plymouth and especially Mass Bay Colony become very fervent. And a lot of the praying town people are arrested, people from Natick. Later on, they're joined by a community up in the Littleton area, and they're put on an island in Boston Harbor, Deer Island, and kept there. They're not allowed, they're inadequate protection. They're not allowed to cut wood for fire or to build protection. We don't know how many people died, but it was probably an incredibly deadly experience. A lot of these people, several of the people on the island, however, still work and help out the colonists, for example, in the negotiation of the release of captives like Mary Rowlandson and many others. So they're trying to still work with the colonists, even though they're incredibly mistreated, in hope that this will improve their situation. In in April and May 1676, the colonial governments of Mass Bay and Plymouth decide, okay, we are really hurting militarily. Indigenous allies play an important role, and they are being reintroduced in the armed forces and the militias of the colony. And so the praying town Indians very actively fight on the side of the colonists again. An incredibly violent war. About 10% of the male population in the colonies, white male population, I should say, gets killed. It's likely that as many as 50% of the indigenous population perishes in the war. Some historians have suggested it might be as many as 7 out of 10 Native Americans that are killed as a result of King Philip's War. Over 1,000 Native Americans are sold into slavery in the Caribbean, mostly Bermuda. The number might be as high as 2,000. Among them are King Philip's wife and his son. And again, King Philip's War is one of those wars where scalp bounties are used quite frequently. And this is a practice that will continue throughout the wars of the 17th and 18th century. So all these wars we don't even hear about anymore. So King William's War, Queen Anne's War, Dummer's War, my favorite war. It's not named because war is that way because war is dumb, but because of the Governor Dummer. King George's War, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In all of these wars, scalp bounties were being used to entice colonists to kill and scalp Native Americans. These scalp bounties were used also for women and children, which makes is a very targeted policy. And if you read the Genocide Convention of 1948, many historians would argue that this actually would fit a genocidal behavior or a genocidal policy. Often, King Philip's War is when the textbooks stop talking about the indigenous presence. And it's as if Native Americans just disappear from New England. And that could not be further from the truth, because there's indigenous people that continue surviving in New England to the present. They survive in New England as enslaved people, as indentured people, just like during the Pequot War and during King Philip's War. Indigenous people in New England play an important role as allies. In Southern New England, they fight alongside British forces and the local militias. Christianity is a big factor in indigenous survival. You have people like William Apis, who you see here on the screen on the right-hand side in the 19th century, or Samson Occam in the 18th century, who fundraised a lot of money for Dartmouth College, which initially was thought out to become a college to educate indigenous children, and then quickly leaves that mission behind. And it's only a mission that Dartmouth College took up in the second half of the 20th century again. So you have indigenous ministers that serve as ministers, but they also serve as teachers. The indigenous people in New England have an incredibly high literacy rate. They work in the factories. Betsy Guppy Chamberlain, who you see on the left, and since there's a lot of Lowell folks up here, she's one of the mill girls. She also writes for the two papers, the New England Offering and the Lowell Offering. And about 90% of her writing deals with women's rights. But I think 10% of her corpus also deals with indigenous rights. And so William Apis and Betsy Guppy Chamberlain, especially in the 19th century, were indigenous people that reminded people in New England when they were talking, oh, indigenous people have disappeared. They were saying, hey, we're still here. Don't forget about us. Native Americans were active in the whaling industry, which is the 19th and 18th century equivalent of the energy oil industry today. Agriculture, domestic labor. There were quote unquote Indian peddlers, Indian doctors and Indian performers. Folk medicine that indigenous peoples realized, hey, if I put on a Great Plains outfit, mainstream New Englanders will buy from me more medicine. And so they put on these garbs, often putting on a show just to being actually quite entrepreneurial. Indigenous people work in construction, logging, river driving, especially in northern New England, and the tourism trades, and again in northern New England, canoe making. So throughout the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, indigenous people are part of the New England economy and continue to be a presence to the present. Anyway, so what is happening increasingly is, I mentioned Native Americans working in the whaling industry, incredibly dangerous work, and in the military, again, incredibly dangerous work. So while the New England population is on the decline in the 18th and 19th century, the male population is even on a steeper decline, which forces a lot of indigenous women to find partners outside of the community. And so some women create relationships, get married to people of African American descent, of European descent, but often the women, their husbands, and their children stay in the community and still remain active culturally, politically, religiously active in their community. But it is people on the outside, Massachusetts officials, other officials in New England, that increasingly look at this quote unquote, what they call intermixing as these indigenous communities ceasing to be indigenous. And so this is the 19th century. Of course, we all learned about the one blood rule. And if indigenous people intermarry with African Americans, apparently, according to that rule, the African American blood is quote unquote stronger. I mean, it's kind of this idiotic, unscientific stuff that today to us seems very ridiculous, but unfortunately was shaping a lot of understandings in the 19th century and really leading to the Nazi Holocaust. If you look at these theories when they really hit sort of the pinnacle. So this is this racism that's being faced, and there's increasing pressure to take rights away from indigenous communities and people, and to really attack and make these communities disappear. That already happens naturally, because over the 18th, 19th century, fewer and fewer of the smaller hamlets, more and more of the smaller hamlets disappear, and there's fewer and fewer communities that are surviving. But still, by the mid-19th century, there's still several strong communities that are around. But then from 1860 to 1880, many of the southern New England states decide to what they call terminate indigenous communities. And so they pretty much close down the reserves. They say to indigenous people, well, you're not indigenous people anymore, and you don't have a reserve anymore. And reserve is what we in New England used to call what today in the modern United States is called reservations. So it's all gone with pretty much political decisions. Indigenous people, of course, they are fighting this tooth and nail. And there's a proud tradition of that. I mentioned William Apis earlier. I mentioned Samson Occam. The religious communities in New England, they had for 18th, 19th century, they had for a very long time fought these policies and really tried to assert indigenous rights and losing increasingly ground, but not for the lack of fighting. And so as termination is being passed as a policy and is being debated as a policy, indigenous people from all over southern New England fight this tooth and nail. It's a fight they lose, but it's a fight that happened nonetheless. And as termination happens, the fight continues. And indigenous people take these cases to the court, and they make the legally very sound, and what I think is the accurate argument is New England states do not have the right to terminate us. That would be the prerogative of the federal government. And because the federal government has not terminated us, this action was illegal. So that is the argument they take to the court. And the courts, as they often are, it's always risky to go to court, they lose. And sort of the legal fiction that emerges here is the argument that the judges repeatedly make is, yeah, well, that is true. The federal government, in fact, has the prerogative. But since these indigenous communities are in the 13 colonies, we have what is called the colonial prerogative. And therefore, these New England states had indeed the right to pass these laws. Nonetheless, despite these legal cases that are in and out of the courts, there is many communities that continue to be very active. Yes, Mohegans, they lose their reserves. The Narragansetts, they lose officially their reserves, but people still stick around. Mashpee, Wampanoags, they lose their reserve, but the people still continue to cling on to their home communities. They cling on to their friends. They cling on to their churches. They cling on to their ceremonial groups. They continue to connect. And these are indigenous communities that continue to exist, even though they might not have a reserve anymore. People like Gladys Tantaquidgeon, who was a Mohegan healer. So she was trained in the traditional medicine of the Mohegan. But she then also became an academic, got her BA, then a PhD in anthropology from UPenn. Her work on ethnobotany in the among Eastern woodland Native Americans is still among, it's a seminal work. But she also, with her family members, uncles, brothers, cousins, they compiled a huge collection of Mohegan history and took that on, and eventually, this is today, a lot of this stuff is displayed into Tantaquidgeon. And this evidence that Gladys and her family members produced was then later used in the federal recognition of the Mohegans. Because what happens in the 1960s is colonial precedent. At some point, one judge just looks at this. Well, that would mean Massachusetts can this and this. Is this a colonial precedent? They could do that and say it's colonial precedent. So that colonial precedent is being thrown out of the courts, and we have all of a sudden a new precedent that helps various communities in New England and in other parts of the Eastern Seaboard to become federally recognized communities. Federal recognition, of course, is very expensive. There's many communities in New England that are not federally recognized. Some of them are state recognized, like the Nipmucks, for example, in Massachusetts, but there's other communities that are not recognized. Joseph Nicolar, just a side note, he was a Penobscot Native American. He wrote this book in the 1890s that I still think is a fantastic read, and in a sense is like doing what anthropologists and historians have only figured out in the last few decades. So he was a man much ahead of his time. And there's really indigenous people all over New England, like Nicolar and Tantaquidgeon, that are preserving the indigenous past and really reminding mainstream society that indigenous people are still there. There's, of course, I've been talking for 35 minutes, so I'm trying to wrap things up relatively fast here so that we have time for questions. There's also a bit of a history with the boarding and residential schools. That goes back to colonial times, really, and then again, sort of the federal boarding schools that were incredibly devastating on indigenous people. The motto was to kill the Indian, quote unquote, to save the men. We haven't really crunched the numbers, but the Canadians have, and it was safer to be a Canadian soldier fighting trench warfare in World War I than it was. Your survival chances were higher than being an indigenous child in what the Canadians call the residential school. So that is part of New England history too, although most of the kids are brought into out-of-state institutions and the Thomas More School in New York that you see here. The other thing that is going on, and there's a great documentary that's called Dawnland, that's made by two movie makers, documentary filmmakers from Boston, that deals with family separation. And family separation is not talked about as much as boarding schools, but it's also a very devastating issue for indigenous communities. And this was pretty much taking children out of their families, merely only for the fact often that they had indigenous parents. And the devastation that brought onto indigenous communities is a very depressing topic. So in the 1970s, Congress passed a law to forbid this kind of practice, but in the state of Maine, family separation in violation of the laws passed by Congress continued until it was ended in 2005. And Maine started having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to kind of come to terms with this past, which of course is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you talk to survivors of residential or boarding schools and survivors of family separation. The violence, incidents of death, rape, abuse. It's just devastating to hear these accounts from people. But there's also persisting legacies and challenges. State and federal recognition, that is something that has gotten better as we saw it, and is a continuous struggle. The issue of land for a lot of New England communities is a big one. Also the issue of Indigenous nationalism, sovereignty and activism. I mean, like for over 50 years now, we have the Day of Mourning down at Plymouth, Massachusetts every year, sort of as a reminder of the other side of the Thanksgiving holiday. Like many poor communities, Indigenous people face challenges in terms of keeping their communities economically strong. And the issue of cultural revitalization. Language preservation is a big factor here against the Wampanoag language preservation program, for example, at Mashpee and in other places. And then environmental issue. For the Penobscot, for example, water rights issue, clean water access is a big issue that is fought over in the courts. I spoke for, I think, 39 minutes, so I want to stop sharing my screen and make myself available for questions now.
So folks, let's give Christoph a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. Crammed a lot of information in there in 40 minutes or so. So folks, we'll take questions and comments from the audience. Feel free to type your comments into the chat, your questions into the Q&A, and we'll take about 15 minutes and get to as many as we possibly can. First question comes from Alice, who writes, was the person, so this is regarding the state seal, was the person who the bow came from a generic Native American, or were they from a specific nation?
I do not know. Maybe the Harvard Peabody Museum. I have no idea. Many people in the Sudbury area, could be what we today call Panacook, could be Massachusetts and various other communities, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Ellen says that traditionally we've been taught that scalping was an Indian invention in practice. Yeah. Is that the case, or was it brought to practice by the colonists?
Honestly, this is this is a very good question. I'm not laughing. It's just because people don't ever like when I don't give straight answers, but the older I get, I find it harder to answer certain things. There seems to be archaeological evidence that seems to suggest that in various areas in North America, there existed pre-contact forms of scalping that were part of warfare. That said, colonists, and I don't know, there's some scholars that say it exists for New England as well, but the evidence is not conclusive, and there is also solid evidence that seems to suggest to the contrary. So, however, whether it's an indigenous invention or it's a colonist invention, colonists definitely make wide use of scalping, and the scalp bounties that people could receive. I mean, that was like 2 years of pay, at like the top rates of scalp bounties. That was 2 years of pay for a common like militia soldier. So we're talking a lot of money. And in the image there, you saw Hannah Dustin. Supposedly she got 50 pounds for scalping probably 9 Native Americans, maybe 10. And if we believe Cotton Mather, who's really one of the only sources that we have there, 7 of them or 6 of them were children. 1 child escaped, 2 women, an old guy, and sort of like maybe 1 guy of fighting age that Hannah Dustin and her 2 allies took out. And I don't want to like belittle Hannah Dustin, because I mean, if I would have been captured, I'm sure there's all kinds of horrible things that are going on in their mind. It's warfare. It's an incredibly violent war. But the fact of the matter is, colonial governments, Massachusetts Bay Colony, paid a lot of money to reimburse people for these scalps that they brought in. And there's private armies that are going off killing Native Americans to bring in those scalps and collect bounties for it. And in California, they've finally made the point to call this a form of genocide. We haven't gotten to that level yet in Massachusetts, but we also still have the seal. So anyway, so I'll leave it at that.
We had a few people ask a question along these lines. Paul asks, why did the lack of domestic animals make Native people more susceptible to introduced diseases? What's that relationship?
Yeah, so that's a good question, Paul. I should have made that more clearly. We get a lot of our diseases from animals, chicken pox, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Europeans, people in Africa and people in Asia had millennia to develop immunity to these diseases. Native Americans, over the course of a century or two, were hit by one disease after another. And so, whereas in Europe and Asia and Africa, these pandemics spaced themselves out, didn't happen as frequently, what really happens in Native America, it's like one virgin, what scholars call a virgin soil epidemic. So a new disease hitting a population in like very short amounts of time. And that really explains why the mortality is so high. Because there's like big killer diseases like smallpox, various forms maybe of the plague, but then even stuff like the chicken pox and measles that do not impact us quite as dramatically, they have an incredibly high impact on Indigenous people. And this is kind of me trying to explain it in a very unscientific and fast way. I hope that that answers your question, Paul, at least to some degree.
Scott asks, did all the Indigenous natives in New England speak the same language like Algonquin? Were they able to communicate amongst themselves?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm sighing because it's a hard one. The question, they're different languages, different dialects, but they're certainly related. So further out west, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, that's linguistically a different language, but there's some relationships between the languages, but in many ways it's very different dialects, and it's kind of like I don't know, it's like if you look at, for example, English dialects, and not necessarily that a person from like Southern England will understand someone from Northern England if they really put on the thick dialect. So I think it's maybe comparable to that.
A name I recognize, he's a previous presenter of mine. I think he might be a colleague of yours, Christoph. David has a question. He says, excellent presentation. This is a vital part of U.S. history that is sorely missing from many public schools across the country. So how do we bring the history of Indigenous people to the mainstream in our schools and universities?
That's a good question. I'm trying. Yeah, no, so I do like volunteer my time and work with teacher workshops and so on. Yeah, and I do find that like a lot of these talks I give, and like people are teachers. So I think there's a lot of people that want to learn more. And as David knows, he works on issues of race and so on. Then there's also the challenges that educators are facing in this sort of culture war dynamics that we're having, which are kind of creating very interesting dynamics for educators, to put it diplomatically.
Question from Alan. How can those of us non-Indigenous residents of New England help Indigenous people? Surely your research and writing has helped us understand injustices, but what can we do to help?
So there is various organizations, various initiatives of land buybacks, various cultural organizations that you can support financially. Yeah, so so I would do that. There's several initiatives, for example, the Kawasaki band of the Pennacook up here, they're trying to like buy some land back of a cemetery of their ancestors. The Mashpee Wampanoag community is trying to do some land buyback initiatives. So it's all kinds of stuff like that I think is worthwhile. And I'm United Alliance of Native Americans in New England and other organizations, mass cultural awareness for Indigenous people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, keep bugging your congressman on the, and not congressman, but, well, also congressman, but also your state representative on the issue of the state seal, although that seems to be hung up in committee and it seems to change, but what to, who knows? But there's also other initiatives in terms of the use of sports mascot, which have, anyway, it's a very complex issue. But they're also quite harmful in terms of having these depiction and like the psychological research points out to really Indigenous people. And let alone on that ground, they should be not used. But anyway, so there's a lot of these initiatives that are going on right now. The legislative action, Indigenous action, maybe someone can put it in the chat. So these are just a few things on top of my head.
Right. And so I strive to be apolitical, but just for informational purposes, in the chat, which I know no one can see but you and I, Patricia notes that there are currently 5 bills in the 2023-2024 session at the State House that are part of the Massachusetts Indigenous legislative agenda. So if folks are interested in what you should be bugging your state representatives and state senators about, Google Massachusetts Indigenous legislative agenda. And I say that just for informational purposes. And then Linda also provided information, which I will put into the chat. Let me see here. I don't want to go too far astray. Celine says, thank you for a profound presentation. I teach history and ethics to high school level students, and the question of reparations comes up regularly. What sources or frameworks do you recommend for thinking through this issue?
That's a very, very good question. And reparation and reconciliation is really not my forte. So I don't want to make any recommendations there. The other thing that's concerning to me is I think we're because we are still sort of like dealing with acknowledgement of the past and these sort of things, I think we're still not at the level of reconciliation, where I think we're still having to put some other things, some other ducks in the row in terms of like dealing with the past in a more accurate and less politicized level. So I'm sorry for copping out on that question.
So Ellen says, thank you, great answers, great presentation. I'm currently reading This Land is Their Land, and this was a terrific compliment to that learning. Can you suggest any way to get involved in supporting First Peoples' efforts to gain respect and recognition?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the same question that I would do otherwise. And not being an Indigenous person, I'm sort of, often it's better to listen and then see what comes about and sort of paying attention to these things, start to attend events. And then I think like synergy will emerge. And so I guess it's the same kind of roundabout answer as to the reconciliation question. There's a lot of things we need to do better as a society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and to the thing, yeah, it's quite possible that that the person was a Nipmuc in, but I mean, there's other things just as likely. So yeah. So I think that was Alice in the chat.
Yeah, Alice has pointed out a few things. And we appreciate that. Anne asks, what were the majority Native Americans along the Merrimack River near places like Lawrence and Methuen? So what nations, what tribes did they belong to?
Yeah, so today we would put them as Pennacook, but I mean, and this is why I'm always a little bit reluctant in trying to, what do we name these people? It's like, again, we're talking about 90% mortality rate. I just remember the kind of economic and political impact that COVID-19 has had. And now put that on such an expedited and more deadly level that with that kind of mortality, I think a lot of the societies were falling apart. And so what we call Indigenous societies today might be what they were calling themselves in the mid-17th century or by the 19th century, but we don't know what they call themselves in pre-contact or pre-colonization times, or and so even if you read kind of the early colonists, there is all kinds of conflicting nomenclature that comes up, so that I'm always very reluctant to say, so what were the people here in the 17th century? And what I often do is like, okay, in Lowell, we had Wamasee, the praying town, and we had Pawtucket, a town that was inhabited by the people of Pawtucket, that in some colonial records are called the Aborigines. In other colonial records, they're called the Pawtuckets. And in other colonial records, they're called the Pennacooks. So even in just 2 decades, in the 1630s and 1640s, 3 different names for what might be the same people. So yeah, that's the kind of situation you face with these kinds of questions. And so this is just me giving an honest answer that I don't know, and I am just honest enough to like say now, and I don't think that on the evidence we can figure this out. There certainly today the descendants communities from these areas would identify themselves as Pennacook. So sorry.
Alice noted in the chat that you referenced a book by Nicolar. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yeah.
And the title of the book is The Life and Traditions of the Red Man. And an anonymous attendee would like to know a little bit more about that book. What exactly is that book about?
So it's kind of a history of the Penobscot. It starts up with the founding stories, Glooskap, the culture hero of the Penobscot, and it's just a very interesting read. You can get it free online. So just dive in, enjoy. If you're like reading that kind of stuff, I think it's a worthwhile read. Deals with a lot of folklore traditions, but then also has kind of an interesting view of the history. I might have it here. I might have it in my basement. So yeah, but yeah, that's a quick answer to a very complex book.
Sure. So folks, we're going to start to wind it down. We'll wrap up in the next 3 to 4 minutes. I'll get to a couple of more questions. Clearly, we're not going to get to all the questions. There's like 20 more questions. So we'll do our best. Vigo, we touched on this a little bit, but let me ask you directly. What is your opinion? So Vigo says on the lack of truth in American history regarding Native Americans for years. Have the history books finally been corrected for the youth of today?
I think that culture war is still being fought. And yeah, not just on Native American history, but on various other fronts. And everything has become so politicized in this day and age that it's, yeah.
So aside from your books, of course, Christoph, are there any books out there that you would recommend to folks on this subject? Specifically, let me see who it was. Shelley asked, my pal Shelley asks, do you recommend Charles Mann's 1491 book?
That's a decent book. Yeah, local author from Amherst, very good, very, very good book. This 1493 is also a good book, and they're like, unlike my books and academic books, they're more affordable. Silverman's book, This Land is Their Land. He grew up in Chelmsford, just north of Lowell, so that's a very good and mass market book. The Mayflower book, some people, I think it's a good book. It's affordable. Lots of stuff at your library. There is several copies of my book in the library system. In the Merrimack Valley, Central, the CW Marsh system in Central Massachusetts has a lot of copies as well. So yeah, there's a lot of good books, and for individual communities too. So yes, there's a lot of good scholarship being produced, and hopefully it will trickle down. And then, of course, a lot of good work done by Indigenous people as well in various local initiatives.
So Christoph, I'm going to circle back to you in about 30 seconds for any closing thoughts you might have. But folks, for those watching live, just a reminder to look for an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs. Also in that email, I'll provide a thank you to all the libraries who partnered with Tewksbury tonight. And just to note, please take 30 to 60 seconds and fill out that feedback survey tomorrow. That is greatly appreciated. So Christoph, I wanted to circle back to you. Do you have any last words for us before we wrap up the talk?
Sort of a Jerry Springer final thought. No, I really don't. Thank you so much, everyone, for making it out. I know it's a difficult time of the year, and getting an extra hour out of your day. Certainly, yes, Roxanne's Indigenous History, the People's History, very good book as well. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's History, the Indigenous People. Yeah, so it's a lot of good stuff out there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Thank you all so much at home for watching. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye. You too.